Well, thank you everyone very much for being here. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about how we at Bellingcat use open source geodata for a different purpose than many of the ways that geodata and those tools were designed originally. We use it for investigating war crimes, for animal trafficking, and for more. So I lead our data science team at Bellingcat on our investigative technology team. And before I dive into some case studies and examples, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what Bellingcat is and what we do. So Bellingcat is an international collective of investigative journalists and researchers that pioneered the use of open source data and open sources in general for breaking investigative journalism stories. And when I say open source in this context, I actually mean something that's pretty different from the idea of open source in open source software. I mean open source in the journalistic sense of a source, as in a source of information. So when a journalist is working on a story, they'll oftentimes use what are known as closed sources, a relationship they've cultivated with someone in a politician's office, or a news article that reads according to a person with knowledge of the situation, and so on. At Bellingcat, we only use open sources in our stories. An open source is information that's available to anyone with an internet connection and a willingness to dig for it. So this can include things like geospatial data, like we might be familiar with from Google Maps or OpenStreetMap or marine traffic. It also includes news media, user-generated social media, databases from governments and other sources, archived materials like things on the Internet Archive, and even information that's not necessarily supposed to be public, but nonetheless is, like leaked materials and databases available on the Internet, contact books through sketchy applications you install on your phone, exposed databases on AWS, or dark web markets. All of these things are fair game because none of them depend on any privileged access to gain information to break the story. So Bellingcat first kind of rose to prominence with our investigation into the downing of the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. So MH17 was a commercial airliner en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur that was shot down while flying over Eastern Europe in the Donbass region of Ukraine. All 298 people were killed. They were all civilians, of course. And at the time, that part of Ukraine, like it is now as well, is an active conflict region and was controlled by Russian-backed separatist militias. So after this happened, there was a ton of finger-pointing and confusion about who was responsible. It was right on the border of the line of control in the region. And of course, Russia blamed Ukraine for shooting it down, and Ukraine blamed Russian-backed militias or Russia directly. But there was also a lot of information coming out. People on social media were talking about having seen this anti-aircraft missile launcher moving around Donetsk, the region of Ukraine, in the days prior to the plane being shot down. And in the following weeks, there were lots of reports from people in Russia that they were driving down a road and they saw some military convoy with a bunch of equipment on it heading towards Ukraine. And one of the pieces of equipment they saw looked like a missile launcher. But what Bellingcat realized was that we could do more than just look at kind of the claims people were making, and we could verify it by looking at the actual evidence. So a lot of that evidence, and I apologize that it's hard to see, maybe we could turn the lights off, that might help, was based on kind of dash cam images like this. So in Russia, for insurance purposes, it's really common to put a video recorder in your car and record everything that you see. And people uploaded this video to YouTube or VK or other social media sites when they saw something interesting, like that they happened to be driving past a military convoy. And Bellingcat researchers could take this video and figure out exactly where it was and verify that that's where it was by comparing it to locations they found on the internet. So on the top is a screenshot from the video, and on the bottom is a screenshot from Google Street View. And you can see that it's the same location. It can take a lot of work to find these, of course. You have to start with an area where you think it might be, And in this case, our researchers looked for patterns of forest and roads that looked similar, and then eventually ended up counting the number of telephone poles that passed by as the driver drove down this road, and compared it to the number that they could count on aerial photography in order to make sure that they had found the right location. And researchers did this over and over again, even for some really surprisingly tricky ones to geolocate. Where was this image taken? How could you figure that out? Surprisingly enough, researchers did. There's just a few clues here, but it's enough. This is the location, and this is how that was verified. First, there's a kilometer marker that you can just barely see poking behind the tire of the truck. Secondly, you can see this power pole in the background with a very similar pattern of wires crossing it. And of course, a kilometer marker and a power pole are things that reoccur over and over again along a road. So these alone aren't enough to verify the exact location. But the third thing they noticed is that there's a small pattern of discoloration on the pavement that just happens to perfectly match a pattern of discoloration in the image that crosses the striped line right at the same exact place. So this could be geolocated to a particular spot in Russia. And when you put all this together over weeks and weeks of work, you could establish a trail that showed each location this missile launcher was seen as it traveled across Russia, over the border into Ukraine, and ultimately was used to shoot down the passenger aircraft. So this investigation was really important, obviously, for international justice and for putting this idea that you could look at social media data and use that to break a story into the public prominence. This information has been being used over the past 2 years in The Hague in the ongoing international criminal trial for the shooting down of this aircraft. And the key idea here, is that in open source investigation, if you can figure out where something happened, that can tell you a lot about who was responsible for it and what exactly happened. And that makes a lot of open source investigation a geospatial activity. So I'm going to talk a bit more about how we use geospatial data at Bellingcat and the types of geospatial data that we use. Some of the sources that we use, of course, are aerial and satellite imagery, as we just saw, from both Google Earth and other commercially licensed photography, as well as from public domain imagery like Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2. We use a lot of user source data from OpenStreetMap and Wikimapia, as well as on-the-ground imagery from Google Street View and Mapillary. We use aircraft and vessel tracking data in places like the ADS-B exchange and marine traffic, different kinds of Earth observation data, like data on thermal emission and fire hotspots, and finally topographic data, which oftentimes ends up coming from sources that are designed for outdoor recreation enthusiasts rather than for any kind of investigative journalism. It's an example of how these things fit together. I'll talk briefly about an investigation that a coworker of mine did earlier this year. He cares a lot about animal advocacy and found these videos on YouTube, monetized videos, where people were profiting from essentially showing off baby lions and tigers in a totally inappropriate environment inside someone's personal home. And he was really intrigued by one of these videos that commented that someone from the royal family in the UAE was involved in this, and he wanted to figure out who that was and how exactly they were involved and if he could prove it. So the first thing he looked at was what connections on social media those two YouTubers had in common. And he found one person that looked promising, this guy Sheikh Al-Mualla bin Ahmed Al-Mualla, who was a member of the UAE royal family and was Facebook friends with both of those people. But that alone is, of course, not enough to prove any kind of connection to this. So he looked at social media posts further. And on Instagram and YouTube, he found that all three of these people had recorded videos in what appeared to be the same living room here. And in fact, on Al-Mualla's Instagram page, there was an image, a photo, that had him pictured with the former leader of the UAE. And that same image was printed and framed in one of the videos from the Tiger Cub people. So this showed that, it seems like this Al-Mualla guy has some really strong connection to this house where these tiger cubs keep showing up. But that alone isn't enough. So the next step was to figure out where this house was. So there wasn't a whole lot to go on because the outdoor scenes in the video were really short. But in one of them, you could see this reflection in the window that shows the minaret of a mosque. And that gives you something to start looking for. So he looked in Dubai for every kind of wealthy neighborhood he could find at houses that were in close proximity to a mosque, and eventually found one that looked like it had a good match. You could see here that the carport is the same, outlined in red. You have the same kind of circular shape of the front of the house, and the two palm trees in green are also the same. Of course, this still isn't quite enough. So to verify this further, he went to Dubai's public property register, a government database. And since he now had the location of the house and a suspected owner, he was able to put in all of the information and indeed find a deed for the house in the name of Al-Mu'allah's father, showing that this member of the UAE royal family had a connection to this YouTube ring of baby tiger smugglers. Another source of data that we use frequently is vessel data. So this was used in an investigation I worked on into Frontex. Frontex is the EU's transnational border patrol agency. And we showed that they had been involved in these illegal pushbacks of migrants in the Mediterranean. So a pushback is when a raft or small boat full of people is trying to reach the shore of another country and is intercepted by a boat, usually from the Coast Guard of that country, that tries to keep them from landing on shore. They will frequently steal the motor from the boat or disable it in some way, sometimes tow the boat out of the jurisdiction of that country, or even use the boat itself to make large amounts of wake that dangerously push the raft out of the country. In this case, it was on the Greek-Turkish border. So once the Greek Coast Guard had pushed the raft into Turkish territorial waters, they call up the Turkish Coast Guard and they say, hey, there's a raft full of people without an engine floating around in your waters. You should come deal with this. And then they leave. This is illegal under EU human rights law, and it's been known about for a long time. But it's been primarily the Greek Coast Guard involved with that, and there hasn't been a lot of opportunity for accountability. The involvement of Frontex provided a potential for some kind of transnational accountability. We just had to prove that they actually knew about this and they were involved. So we had this video with some coordinates that seemed to show a Frontex boat involved in a confrontation with migrants. But we needed to show that those coordinates were accurate. To do that, we could use topography. We stitched together the video to show the surrounding landscape around the scene, and then matched it up to the coordinates as rendered in Google Earth. And you can see it's the same situation. We could also use the AIS data from the ships. In general, when these ships are involved in an incident like this, they turn their transponders off, so they no longer transmit their location data so that it's publicly viewable. We looked at nearly 100 incidents over the course of this summer in order to find one where they had forgotten to turn their transponder off. And we had some data that showed that the ship was was in visual range in close proximity of this migrant raft, which meant that Frontex's public statements that they were not involved and they had no awareness of this pushback activity were completely implausible. They were later investigated in a parliamentary inquiry in the European Parliament, resulting in some consequences for Frontex leadership. So that's how we can kind of use topography and vessel data to show a story. Again, data that's publicly available to anyone looking on the internet. I mentioned that we use outdoor recreation data a lot, and one example of that is PeakVisor, this tool for finding the names of mountains. Oftentimes, we're matching up kind of sketchy imagery that, it doesn't exactly look the way that Google Earth renders it. And our researchers find that the kind of lower fidelity rendering of tools like PeakVisor makes it easier to verify that a scene is where they think it might be. So here was an extrajudicial massacre in Ethiopia that was verified to a particular location on this plateau by one of our researchers, providing evidence for who the soldiers were that were involved in the killings. We also use fire data a lot, and in the interest of time, I'll skip this, but essentially conflict is often associated with fires. When you have shooting and explosions, things catch on fire. So this data that's designed for like wildfire monitoring can be really useful, for instance, for showing the advance of troops across a terrain. And then finally, we oftentimes do more traditional GIS or data journalism with a workflow that might be more familiar to people here. For instance, in this investigation of US coronavirus relief aid, we looked at how it was distributed across different communities in the US by taking public government data, joining it with census demographic variables and shapefiles for census regions, and then creating maps of the patterns. And you can see things here like in Houston, where the west side of Houston, which is very wealthy, had significantly higher uptake rates of this coronavirus relief aid, whereas restaurants and small businesses on the poorer east side of Houston had very little access to this money. So this was, again, a workflow that you're probably more familiar with, and I'll skip that in time as well. So another thing that we really do on the investigative tech team is we make tools for geospatial, for open source investigations. And we make, in particular, open source software tools that allow our researchers and other researchers to explore new methods in their work. So I'll talk about two examples of those here now. One is a tool that a tech fellow of ours who worked with us for a little while completing a PhD created for locating missile batteries. So Sentinel-1, which some of you might be familiar with, is a satellite that images the Earth features using radio reflections at 5.4 gigahertz, which also happens to be the same frequency used by missile defense batteries. So when you're trying to get a clean image of the Earth, this is really annoying. When you're trying to figure out where missile defense systems are, it's really useful. And because it images with two paths, you can figure out pretty precisely, I mean, this is like within a couple kilometers, that there's a missile defense system deployed at this site. So he used this to look at whether or not Saudi Arabia might have known about an attack that was coming on one of their oil processing facilities by looking at how often these missile defense systems were used over time, and then eventually ended up creating a tool in Google Earth Engine that let any researcher do this in a graphical user environment without having to program anything. Another tool that I've been working on is a way of using OpenStreetMap data for geolocation. Like we saw earlier, if you find just a few things, like a power pole and a sign, it can give you lots of hints about where an image was taken. And a lot of this data is in OSM, but researchers have a really hard time using it. You know, overpass is great, but it's fiendishly difficult to learn, as many of you might have familiarity with. So here's an example of an image that we can geolocate using the tool I made by simply dragging and dropping features that might be of interest, like a convenience store, a fountain, a railroad, setting the distance between them that we want to search, choosing an area to search in, and then it queries the entire OSM database in that search area to find a list of everywhere where those features occur in proximity to each other. A researcher can then take that and download it as a KML file, which they can put into Google Earth, their preferred tool for kind of exploring this geospatial data, and look at it further. This needs relatively few server resources to run because PostGIS makes it really easy to efficiently index everything. I'm essentially stripping out all unnecessary data and just putting all the tags in an HStore column that's indexed well. And the other thing I realized here is that researchers are super confused about geometry types. Is something a point or a polygon? And it's hard to tell how it's going to be indicated in OSM. And it's tough also because that doesn't cleanly map to node, way, and relation, as many of you might be aware. So we made this as simple as possible. And it's been being used by some of our researchers and the wider public already. It's open source, you can take a look. And finally, I'd like to close by talking about some of our work in trying to bridge the open source investigation and the open source software communities. So hopefully you've seen that geodata has a lot of potentially surprising uses beyond its original use case. And the way I like to think about discovering these use cases is thinking about what would happen if we were to run a tool in reverse. As an example, Especially if you work with OSM, you might be familiar with thinking about taking an image, like a picture from Mapillary, at a known location, and using that to generate map data that you can put into the OSM map. And there's some interesting research on that, making that process easier for people. If any of these people are here, by the way, I would be interested in talking to you. But what we often do at Bellingcat is the reverse of that. We take an image with an unknown location and map data that we already have, and we use that together to come to a location that we want. So what would happen if we ran other GIS tools in reverse? That's something that kind of might inspire us to think about the investigative potential of the tools that are already out there and what we're working on, which of course journalists might not be already aware of. So we really want to try to connect journalists and technologists so that there can be more awareness of those kinds of opportunities. One of the ways we do that is through our Discord server, which is open to the public, and I invite anyone interested to join. You can collaborate with software developers, researchers, and volunteers on interesting projects. And another way we've been doing that is through our hackathons. We'll have another one later this year in Amsterdam that's also open to the public, so if you're interested, talk to me. Some of the projects we've done are large language model matching of military tribunals in India, searching OSM based on like the angle of road intersections, and browser extensions that make it easier for researchers who have to work with traumatic imagery. So I'll end again with another call to collaborate with us if you're interested. Maybe you know of a data source that could be useful. Maybe you have an idea for something you're interested in building or investigating. And maybe you just think one of these tools is cool, or my architecture for the OSM tool was a little bit iffy and I should change it. Reach out. We have a GitHub where you can find all of our open source tools. That's the invite link for our Discord, and you can find my email and my Mastodon there as well. I don't think I have time for questions now, but I'm happy to talk to anyone later today or later this week. Come find me after the talk, and thank you again for being here.